All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology, and I am your host, Doug, and today we are going to be looking at the Nikon D4, and it's going up against the Pentax, the K5 IIs. All right, I've just released, I want to say, two main reviews. I redid the Canon 5D Mark III review, so that the ISO range is completely thrown out there, and I also did a universal balancing of the two cameras so that you could see the dynamic range, and I want to say the color system that they use, and you could pair the Digix 5 processor up against the Prime 2 processor, which, by the way, if you guys don't know, Canon does the whole Digix processor thing. Pentax does the Prime processor thing. So you got that. Also, I have done a video, or I did a video, not done. I did a video that dealt with the Nikon D7100 going up against the Pentax K5 II, and as far as that goes, you have the Nikon with the new Toshiba 24 megapixel sensor with the X-Speed 3 imaging processor going up against the Pentax K5 IIs. Um, if I said K5 II, I meant to say K5 IIs. I'm sorry. K5 IIs, Sony 16 megapixel sensor, along with the once again Prime 2 sensor. So, what brings us to this review? Well, you know, we've done quite a few reviews on Nikon cameras, and truthfully, every single time the Nikon camera goes up against, the Pentax, it gets crushed. That's pretty much what happens. Okay, there are no ands, no ifs, no buts about this. So, what I wanted to do this time around is I just decided, you know what, I'm going to take the most advanced Nikon full frame system that is out there at this point in time in terms of how Nikon sells it, and I'm going to put it up against the most advanced compact sensor unit that is out there based on performance. So this is how we came up with the D4 Nikon, or Nikon D4, versus the Pentax K5 IIs. Now, I do want to throw out there that for the sake of this conversation, both images in terms of the raw files were processed in Corel. Both were shot with the same Sigma 70 millimeter 2.8 lens. Okay, so those things are all the same. When I use Corel, what I did is I simply used the balance system. The same balance system I used for the Nikon D7100 when I put it up against the Pentax, and the same balance system that I used when I put it up against the Canon, not the Canon, sorry about that, but the Canon 5D, Mark III system. So the test that you're seeing here today is a highly valid test based on what I've done before. So there's no difference in this. There's something to keep in mind about this, though, as we go through this test and as you guys see what you're going to see. I need you to keep in mind that the Nikon D4 runs $6,000. And I also want you to keep in mind that the Pentax K5 IIs runs roughly about $1,200. Okay, so let's just say they're roughly about that range. If you're talking, body only, it's about I want to say 1,100. I take that back. It's about 1,100, 1,000 now. It's not even 1,200. It's actually had a drop in price. But the Nikon, D4 is still, about 6,000. So, you're talking about literally the Nikon costing 6 times the amount of the Pentax unit in this. So, as we go through these conversational pieces that we're going to have here, you have to keep that in mind. Now, the way both of these cameras work is on the baseline. Both of these cameras use a 16 megapixel sensor. Now, the Nikon uses a full frame sensor, the Pentax uses a compact sensor. So the Nikon has the advantage on sensor size. However, what you're looking at for the beginning of this is you are looking at the Nikon with its Speed 3 imaging processor versus the Prime 2. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist here to understand this, that the Prime 2 imaging processor is clearly superior to the Speed 3 imaging processor. Okay, so in other words, Pentax does use a more advanced imaging processor than Nikon does. And this is clearly shown at your beginning ISOs. And we're talking about the auto ISOs that are set up here. So the way it works with the Nikon and the way it works with the Pentax is they basically have ISOs of 100 to 12,800. Okay, that's about the auto setup that you have there for both units. If you're basing it off of those ISO ranges, then it does go to the Prime, the Prime 2 imaging processor. Dynamic range, you can easily see here. You'll notice the Pentax image is actually brighter, and keep in mind that Krell actually balances out the the hues, the saturations, the contrast, the whole 9 yards. So that's why the Pentax has a better that's why the Pentax has a better dynamic range. Tripping over my words here, is due to the fact that you're in a situation here where you see it in the form of it being a brighter image. Okay, so the brighter the image, the better the dynamic range. That's the easiest way to look at this. Also, if you look at, I want to say, the whites, you look at the lighter tones, so on and so forth, and how that plays out. If you look at the multi-exposure throughout the image, you will notice that the Pentax has a fuller, range of light than the Nikon does. Okay, and that's just, how that falls out on that end. Now, the next thing that you want to look at, or we should be looking at here, is the noise. What you will see is you're going to see two types of noise structures, all right, between the Nikon and the Pentax. Now, keep in mind here, the Pentax actually has more sharpness than the Nikon does because it has the anti-aliasing system removed from it in terms of filtering. The Nikon, I'm not sure if they do it or not because I didn't see that stated anywhere in terms of Nikon literature or anybody talk about that. But if it does have that removed from its system, then it's definitely not proving it against the Pentax here in terms of actual sharpness and clarity. Now, part of the sharpness and clarity that you actually have that plays out in the Pentax's favor between it and the Nikon the D4 is the fact that the dynamic range and color are on key. So once again, these things actually can add to a camera's sharpness. All right, the same way as in some cases you can actually strip away saturation, which adds more definition, or more detail to an image, so on and so forth. But when you're looking at these images here, you clearly see that the Pentax does have an overall greater sharpness, an overall in-your-face kind of presentation than what the Nikon does. Even if you just look at the cups. I mean, you look at the cups and then you look at the cloths underneath, you'll actually see that. Now, when we talk about the colors, the saturations, the hues, the white balance, so on and so forth. Okay, from the Nikon D4's angle, I was a little disturbed by it because at a $6,000 price point, I really thought it would do better than the Nikon, the D7100. I thought it would also do better than some of the other guys throughout the lineup. Now, the D7100 is a newer unit and it uses a newer system. But the truth is this, is that at $6,000, I don't care how much newer the $1,600 camera is. It should not be able to get as close as it does in terms of its overall presentation to the camera that's going to cost $6,000. And I mean this from a noise control perspective. Now, arguably what you could say, what makes the Nikon D4 a $6,000 camera is the fact that its color system in terms of tones, are actually, you know, slanted more towards, you know, the Pentex's, uh, direction. So within the entire Nikon lineup, we've had the Pentax just go through, and literally it's just cut down every single Nikon it's gone up against. If you've ever wanted to have validation about the coloring system that Pentax, has had going up against Nikon, well, guess what? You just found it in their $6,000 camera. Now, going back to what I said though, about the color and the saturations. The Nikon, if you look at the color palette, clearly tries to overplay colors like blues, oranges, and certain other colors that you'll see if you just look at the color palette. So there is an overemphasis of blues, of the purple, so on and so forth. Nikon has always had issues with these colors. I am happy to say though that this time around the red looks like a red, it doesn't look like a burgundy. So I'm going to give that to the Nikon on that end. But when it comes to colors, simply put, the Pentax just hits the tones just right. I mean, it does do an excellent job when it comes to colors and tones, and I'm going to actually say that the Pentax does have a better color system than the Nikon does. White balance. White balance, it's kind of iffy here with the Nikon, okay? The Nikon has this weird effect where it's actually warmer on one end of the image, and then it becomes colder on the other end of the image. Okay, so the way it works is that if you look at the left side of the image, you have in the, well, shall we say shadows, if you will, further down south of the image, you have this kind of, in the left-hand corner, a very yellowish, tinge that's forming in the image. Where if you look at the right side of the D4, as you go through the images, you will notice that it is very cold. And there's a lack of consistency there. However, if you look at the Pentax, the K5 IIs, you'll notice throughout the image that everything is actually, presented correctly. And once again, this just goes back to the whole, Speed 3 processor versus the Pentax, using its Prime 2. Now, the truth is that I do see this, I have seen this in other Nikon models. So the D4 has an inherent flaw in it from that end. Okay, that's just the relationship of having the Nikon system in your camera. Is that when it comes to white balance control and coloring, Nikon is very awkward when it comes to that. And, that's something that they're going to have to work out over time. Hopefully, with this new alliance that they have with Toshiba, they might be able to work those kind of things out. So, that's how that's going to play out from that end. Now, autofocusing system. Okay, so here we go. We're talking a $6,000 camera versus a $1,000 camera for the sake of this conversation. Autofocusing system. The Nikon's going to have 51 autofocusing points. Okay. In the overall apparatus of those autofocusing points, you are talking about a speed of 0.254. Okay? 0.254. The Pentax is going to have a total of, for the sake of the conversation, we'll say 11 autofocusing points. And there you have a total autofocusing speed of 0.118. Now, I need to point out something about the Pentax versus the Nikon here, okay? That autofocusing system that I just gave you for the Pentax is based on the Pentax K5, which only runs roughly about, I want to say, 8-ish now, about $800. The K5 II/K5 IIs, those actually have a faster autofocusing system that has not been rated. So literally, when you talk about the Pentax autofocusing system overall versus the Nikon's autofocusing system overall, I've said it before, I will say it again. Who cares if you have 100 autofocusing points in your camera? If I still have 2 to 3 times the autofocusing capability in sheer speed that you have, then I automatically win. That is how this works. I mean, it's the truth. The stronger your autofocusing system is, the better you're going to get that shot. It is a fact. It is a hardcore fact of photography. Now, when you get up into the Nikon, D4's range of autofocusing systems, sometimes manufacturers will have like these whacked out methods of how a unit will autofocus, saying, you know what, well, this is able to pick up certain signatures, so on and so forth, which makes it a more robust autofocusing system. That is all smoke and mirrors. That's what it is. Anybody who is telling you that an ultra advanced autofocusing system that has so many points, that's able to pick up signatures in whatever way it can, that still only plays out to a 2.5 when it's all said and done, is absolutely crazy. When it's going up against a more simplistic autofocusing system, which is, a 0.1 or below. It's just absolutely crazy. It's madness. You can't win under those kind of conditions. Now, to add insult to injury there, the center focus of the Nikon, meaning its peak performance, is actually a 0.28. So even if we took away, the nifty 50, okay, on the autofocusing range here, or 51 that is, and we went just with the dead center focus, you're talking about a 0.208. If I said 0.28, then I'm wrong. I meant to say 0.208. I correct myself there. With the Pentax, you are talking about below a 0.104. That is correct. The Pentax still, even under these conditions, has more than twice the autofocusing system. And keep in mind, this is on the K5. It's not the K5 II or the K5 IIs. So this really hurts the Nikon when it comes to the autofocusing method that we're, that we're supposed to be going after. This is one of the reasons why I was terribly unimpressed with the autofocusing system of the D7100 when they came out and said, oh, it comes from the D300. I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, if your unit at $6,000 doesn't have a that thereof in terms of a, robust autofocusing system going up against, a unit that is meant to be within the price range with a decent lens of the D7100 coming from Pentax, then how on earth is the, D7100 itself going to stand a chance? I mean, I never saw that. But here, this gives you insight to why Nikon units tend to be on the, wishy-washy side when it comes to autofocusing, in terms of sheer autofocusing power, when we relate it to speed. Now, sensitivity. Remember, one of the big things right now about the D7100 is that it has a -2 exposure value on its sensitivity when it comes to autofocusing. This is supposed to be one of those really cool things. Likewise, the D4 has the exact same thing. Here's the problem. The D4 is $6,000 and its autofocusing sensitivity is a -2 exposure value, where the Pentex's exposure value is a -3. That means that in darker situations, I can go with the Pentax. In darker situations, I cannot go with the Nikon D4. So when it comes down to sheer autofocusing capability, if you are a person who does wedding photography, if you're a person who wants to photograph bands, if you're a person who, likes to go into nightclubs and, you want to sit up here and pop off those shots and stuff like that, and you want to have something that's reliable on the autofocusing end, well, here it is right here, okay? The Pentax has more than twice the autofocusing speed per point of the Nikon, right there, plus it's able to go one whole exposure value below what the Nikon can to get the shot and to get it right. Simply put, we go back to the concept here that the Nikon D4 is $6,000 and the Pentax is only roughly, I want to say, about $1,000 to $1,100. when you just talk about the body itself. These are the kind of things that you really, and I mean really, have to think about when you're, when you're picking out your camera. And that, is a sad, state of affairs. Now, we talk about clear time because naturally the Nikon is a speed demon. So let's talk about clear time here, okay? And we're going to talk about shot to shot. All right. In other words, you take one shot. What's your clear time? So you can take another shot. For the Nikon, it basically, RAW plus JPEG is going to be about a 0.4. Okay, so it's about roughly half a second when it's all said and done. Okay. The Pentax RAW slash JPEG is going to be about a 0.27, roughly a third of a second. So the Nikon's roughly, half a second. The Pentax is roughly a third of a second. Now, here's going to be the big seller to the Nikon D4. Okay, so the stats that I gave you are actual factual stats that have already been tested, so on and so forth. There's no debating that, okay? But let's now look into the deeper meaning of what this camera is really all about so that we can get a better handle on this. It's speed. Okay, it's speed. Although you don't have autofocusing speed, what you're talking about with the Nikon unit is you're talking about the fact it shoots 11 frames a second versus the Pentax, which only shoots 7 frames a second. Now keep in mind, if you're talking 11 plus 7, that basically means for every frame you gain with that Nikon, it's going to cost you $1,000 over the Pentax. That's what it's going to do. Now, I'm not saying that if you need 11 frames a second, that that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, what I would be saying is that is, perfectly fine if that's what you need in terms of actual speed. But when we talk about 7 frames a second, what does 7 frames a second realistically mean in the real world? Well, it basically means something like a golf swing. If you want to be able to track someone's golf swing, if you're shooting at 7 frames a second, you're going to be able to make it happen. And that's pretty tough to do. If you're talking about someone diving into a pool, 7 frames a second, bam. Once again, it's easy to do. So from that end, I would have to say that from a speed perspective, the Nikon wins it out. But you do have to look at the practicality of the speed when we talk about it. It simply just deals with the practicality. For the price of the Nikon, I can buy the Pentax, I can buy a 16 to 50 millimeter lens, I can buy a 50 to 135 lens. Hell, I can even get the 50 to 250 millimeter lens, all premier lenses from them. Meaning I'm going to be able to hit these speeds just like I've been talking to you guys about. And on top of that, I can get myself, a wireless flash setup, and poof, there I go. And that's just for the body of the Nikon. Now, granted, some people are going to say, well, you know what, I've invested in Nikon lenses, so on and so forth. Listen, investing in Nikon lenses, all right, making that investment, there comes a point when you have to look at something and say, if it takes you $6,000 to upgrade from point A to point B, and another manufacturer is beating you out on the baseline, I'm talking on the baseline here, okay? Is beating you out on the baseline, at $1,000 versus your $6,000 on key fundamental elements of what a camera is really supposed to be about, at that point you better start scratching your head and wondering, how important are these lenses to you? Now, with that part being said, one thing I do want to point out is that clearly you're looking at Nikon in their highest form here. And where Nikon is going to overtake the Pentax is when you hit that 25,000 ISO. Okay, the moment you hit that 25,000 ISO, that's when things actually take a turn for the worse for the Pentax versus the Nikon in comparison. Okay? And the reason why I bring this up is because when you're talking about the Nikon and when you're talking about what is its real advantages over the Pentax, it really comes down to, I want to say, that 25,000 ISO going forward. It does. Simply put, the 25,600 ISO going beyond that does play in the Nikon's favor. Now, Pentax has recognized this, and as a brand, they have come to the conclusion that they do have to make a jump into full frame. Now, what is the relevancy in this? Okay, what is the relevancy in this discussion? Because we are talking about actually the Nikon D4, not so much about the Pentax K5 IIs. But there is a relevancy to this, all right? Because in the Pentax, conglomerate, there's a division whether they should go full frame or whether they should not. Now, my attitude about it is this. I don't think for the level of output that they will get from full frame, it will be worth it in the end. I don't. I mean, sure, they can give the camera more frames per second. Sure, they can, obviously get way better, ISO ranges and stuff like that out of the K5 IIs. Beyond 25,000, you could do those things. But at a 6 gram price point, okay, because this is where they actually cut into Nikon, but this is where Nikon's able to push back. I mean, Nikon's able to push back at the 6 gram price point with those higher ISOs. And with the movie recording capabilities and stuff like that, I mean, that's really what you're spending the 6 grand on. You're just not spending it on the auto ranges of the camera. You're not spending it on that. At the 6 grand price point, I completely disagree with the concept of a full frame system from Pentax. What they need to do is go with the medium format system. They've already been willing to produce it at 10 grand. That's the first thing. This is what they need to do. They need to sit up here and basically junk that system, create a brand new system that is a 40 megapixel system that shoots at 7 frames a second. And if you would like to increase your speed to a whopping 14 frames a second or 12 frames a second, then it reverts down to, of course, 20 megapixels. That's what it does. In addition to that, have a good conversion system for the lenses so that those can be used in, some way, shape, or form. And, there you go. There's probably going to have to be a crop factor involved. We're not quite sure what they can figure that part out. That is my 2 cents about that. I think one of the major issues that a lot of Pentaxians have had, and also a lot of full frame users have had, is on the Pentaxian side, as you can see, based on these tests, there is a reason not to go with full frame. I've always said this. I'm a believer in it. Same thing as if you're a Fuji user, which I am. Surprisingly, yeah, there's a reason not to go with full frame. But to give the deliverance of performance that should be at this kind of price point, at a 6 grand price point, I just don't see how it could be found in a full frame coming from a brand like Pentax. I believe that when you go, you got to go hard and you got to go in all the way, or you simply just go home. Hence, that's where the medium format comes from. Also, what this would do is this would basically open Pentax up to the tier of a greater apparatus of photography that would put them in line with like Leica, Hasselblad, so on and so forth. Now, in reality, people here might be looking at this and saying, okay, wait a minute here. So basically, you want to have a medium format system that's basically built like the, K5 IIs. Essentially, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. With a backwards, speed boost. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Some people might look at that and say, well, then it should cost more than their $10,000 medium format camera. And my answer to this is, no, it shouldn't. If anything, it should cost less. And now you see the reason why. The D4 shows exactly why Pentax ought to go with a medium format system. They've already got it. They should stick with it. And they just need to build a more robust system. If they ever want to sit up here and take Nikon off the map, that's the kind of thing they're going to have to do to make it happen. In reality, looking at this test, there is no reason to why the Nikon D4 should have been this close to the Pentax K5 IIs when you're talking neck and neck. There's no reason for that. I mean, like I said, if you really believe in the D4, you've got to be doing it based on the video system. You've got to be doing it based on, I want to say, the the faster 11 frames per second. That's what you're doing it on. Those are the only two redeeming values that you have to work from. The idea that you have a full frame sensor at the same megapixel setup as the crop sensor, and from an ISO of 100 to 12,800, you have the differences that you have there. That's just simply crazy. It really is. Like I said, you can buy yourself a whole suit and you can get yourself studio equipment for the price that you're going to pay on that, D4. You can do it all over again. That's really all I got to say about it, guys, from this end. I mean, that's mainly it. And you guys can take what you want away from this. I know that some people are going to be, shattered by this, as they tend to be with a lot of the other reviews I do. And I know some people are going to want to believe what they've seen. I mean, the only thing I can tell you is this, is that if you're a person who's bought a D4, Nikon D4 within, the past couple weeks or whatever, if you can return the sucker, return it. Shoot. Unless you need that 11 frames per second, or unless you really need that video capability, there is no other reason to have the camera. There simply just isn't. We didn't even do a resolution test, which I guess we should have done that, but we didn't. So anyways, you guys take care, and I'll talk to you later. All right, bye-bye.